The Book of Mormon is full of behavior and reasoning that any responsible parent would find reprehensible in their children. The most egregious example is 3 Nephi chapter 9, in which Jesus describes destroying the inhabitants of many, many cities. Zarahemla is burned. Moroni is drowned. It says all the inhabitants were drowned. The city of Moronihah was covered in earth. Gilgal was destroyed. Onihah was destroyed. Mokum was destroyed. Gediamnah, Jacob, Gimgimno, Jacobagath, etc., etc. All of these cities, the inhabitants were destroyed. Now, apologists for the Book of Mormon are fond of pointing out that the people in these cities were wicked because they had rejected the prophets. But a moment's reflection should remind us that there's no such thing as a human city that doesn't have babies and children. In other words, obviously innocent people in it. And indeed, if you go back to 3 Nephi chapter 8, at the very end, the last verse says that our children would have been spared if we had repented. So say the inhabitants of these cities as the destruction is starting to rain down. And so there is no question in this narrative that Jesus is responsible for killing babies and children. Now, that's the most egregious example in the Book of Mormon, but there are other remarkable stories that should give any parent pause. In Alma 17, we have a story about a prophet named Ammon who is trying to curry favor with a king. And so he tends the livestock of this king, and thieves come along and try to steal some of the livestock, and so Ammon cuts off all of their arms. When a prophet uses violent means to solve problems, it should invoke the question, if he's under the inspiration of an all-knowing, all-powerful God, why is God not able or willing to help the prophet use other means? Any sixth grader would have enough imagination to think of how these thieves could have been thwarted, but the prophet Ammon had to resort to cutting off all of their arms. Similarly, in 1 Nephi, toward the beginning of the Book of Mormon, in chapter 4, there's a story in which a prophet named Nephi needs to have some information contained on some brass plates. The brass plates are owned by somebody named Laban. And Nephi is commanded by God to go get the brass plates. And as he goes out to get the brass plates, he discovers Laban has fallen in the street in a drunken stupor. And Nephi is commanded by the Holy Spirit to decapitate Laban and then take the brass plates. Again, we have to ask, why would an omniscient, omnipotent God not be able to find another method of getting the information that Nephi needed for his descendants? Why was a messy decapitation necessary? These are the kinds of stories that appear throughout the Book of Mormon. These stories should make anyone with a conscience wonder about the morality of the Jesus described in the Book of Mormon and the morality of the God who inspired the prophets in the Book of Mormon. Now consider what goes on in the mind of a Book of Mormon apologist. They believe that all of these events actually happened, and they defend them as the acts of a moral God.